In the previous video, we talked about a particular case, HM, who had his hippocampus removed along with some other parts, and this led to amnesia, particularly anterograde amnesia for new explicit memories, with some sparing of other memories. And here, we're going to focus on those other memories and those other parts of the brain, and we'll talk about other sources of amnesia that don't come from surgery. So here's a figure from the textbook, if you're following along in my class, where we've got different parts of the brain that are involved in memory beyond the hippocampus. So here is the hippocampus in the medial part of the temporal lobe, the surrounding medial temporal lobe, and then highlighted are other areas. So we're going to walk through in a specific role in different types of memory. So the cerebellum, which you may know is involved in balance, will also get involved here in memory. The amygdala, which you may know is involved in emotions, particularly fear, is going to get involved in memory. The thalamus, which you might know as a sensory relay, actually has some connections to memory as well. The basal forebrain and the striatum, not listed here because it would cover up other things, which you may know are involved in movement, are going to be involved in like motor memory. And then the prefrontal cortex, the very front of our frontal lobe, is going to be involved as well. So a wide area, different parts of the brain that are going to specialize for other kinds of memory that are in addition to the kinds of memory that we saw in HM's case, new explicit memories. So let's walk through some of these. The first one, the bottom part of our temporal lobe, the ventral side of our temporal lobe, called the inferotemporal cortex, you may remember from our vision chapter, is involved in object recognition. Well, object recognition is memory, right? If I recognize that a hammer is a hammer, or I recognize that my mother is my mother, I'm getting that from memory, right? So none of this is in the hippocampus necessarily, right? We're not specialized in the hippocampus. It's below the hippocampus in the bottom part of our temporal lobes. This is where we have our fusiform face area, which specializes in faces and other really well-known things. Perihippocampal place area, so it's near the hippocampus, but not the hippocampus, specialized for remembering places you've been. And there's a lot of studies on these areas in terms of how memory is stored there and whether there might be particular cells that are attuned to particular people. Like, do you have a grandmother cell? Do you have a Halle Berry cell? And studies have been done where they've shown pictures of famous people, like Halle Berry when she was super famous, in different pictures of her and see if the same neurons light up for Halle Berry in different contexts. There's kind of like a network, kind of like sparse coding network of cells that all do seem to respond to the same people. So memory is stored there outside of the hippocampus for specific things. The amygdala is going to get involved in memory. You may be aware that emotion modulates memory, so emotional memories are processed differently than less emotional memories, particularly in terms of fear, and then fear conditioning, right, which is implicit memory. So I may be conditioned to sort of automatically have a fear response in response to certain stimuli, like, if I'm afraid of spiders, right, I'm not explicitly saying that I'm afraid of spiders just by seeing one and being afraid, right? That implicit conditioned response, the amygdala is going to get involved in that kind of memory. The prefrontal cortex, the very front or anterior part of our frontal lobe, is involved in working memory and also involved in retrieving things from long-term memory. So not storing in long-term memory, but retrieving from long-term memory. As we talked about with the case of HM, working memory, that ability to maintain things for 20 to 30 seconds and control our attention and stay on task and maintain our goals. That's prefrontal cortex, frontal lobe activity instead of hippocampus. The cerebellum and our striatum, which are involved in balance and movement, respectively, get involved in implicit memories like some conditioning, but also in habit formation and procedural memories. Okay, so these kinds of implicit connections are going to involve some of these areas that are related to movement, balance, and coordination, and that kind of thing. And then finally, the thalamus, which we know is a sensory relay, right? Well, our memories are embodied in a sensory world that we experience, right? So it makes sense that there's going to be connections between the thalamus and other memory centers and long-term storage of memories, right? And it turns out that the thalamus is linked to the amygdala, the thalamus is linked to the hippocampus, the thalamus is linked to other areas of the brain in that limbic system. And so damage to the thalamus is going to lead to memory impairments as well. So that relay that we talk about as a sensory relay is also going to be kind of relaying other things that are going to affect our memories. Okay, so here's that picture again. Cerebellum and striatum are involved in implicit memories, prefrontal cortex in working memory, the thalamus, particularly the mediodorsal nucleus of the thalamus, is going to be involved in memory more generally, as it kind of coordinates sensory activity and long-term storage. The amygdala is going to modulate fear and fear conditioning. The inferotemporal cortex, the bottom part of the temporal cortex, is going to have a specific role for object recognition and specializations for faces and places and that sort of thing. And all of that goes beyond the hippocampus itself. Just like there are other areas besides the hippocampus involved in memory, there are other sources of amnesia too, right? Besides having your hippocampus removed, right? One of those sources we talked about in chapter 10 of this course on Alzheimer's disease. You may remember that Alzheimer's disease involves a buildup of protein plaques and tangles, tau and amyloid specifically, sort of building up and getting tangled and blocked neurons. And this is a result and causes sort of a cycle for acetylcholine cells in the hippocampus, the basal forebrain, and elsewhere up into the frontal lobes and parietal lobes as well. And because Alzheimer's disease is progressive, you get what's known as mild cognitive impairment at first, that then leads to amnesia. And in Alzheimer's disease, you get, as comparison to HM, who just had issues forming new long-term memories, in Alzheimer's amnesia of the Alzheimer's type, you have issues with working memory in the frontal lobes and in long-term memory as well. So it's a bit more global because that damage moves up from the hippocampus into the basal ganglia and then upward. Ultimately, dementia occurs, which is um, a term for what happens when we move from mild cognitive impairment to severe cognitive impairment, and thinking in general becomes difficult to do. Korsakoff syndrome is another source of amnesia. Korsakoff syndrome is most commonly seen in people with severe alcoholism. Alcohol itself has some physiological effects on the brain, right, and can kill brain cells. But there's also dietary issues with alcoholism where you get most of your calories from alcohol and not from food. And then there's some cascading effects on our metabolism. Ultimately, alcoholism can lead to thiamine deficiencies, which is B1 vitamin deficiency, and then nuclei specifically in the thalamus die, leading to severe anterograde and retrograde amnesia. You can get Korsakoff syndrome from other sources, anything that's going to lead to a thiamine deficiency effectively, right? So sometimes you see this in anorexia, in weight loss surgery, or people with like genetic issues absorbing thiamine. So it's not necessarily that alcohol leads to amnesia in the case of Korsakoff syndrome. It's that alcoholism leads to thiamine deficiency. and it's the thiamine deficiency that leads to the amnesia, if that makes sense, right? So yes, being drunk can cause memory issues, and alcoholism can cause Korsakoff syndrome, but it's not that being drunk causes Korsakoff syndrome. It's the thiamine deficiency that comes along with alcoholism. And then finally, concussions lead to amnesia. So in a closed head injury, right, you still get your skull there, right? You get a closed head injury and experience a concussion, which is a loss of consciousness, right? Typically, people experience some level of memory loss. That memory loss is typically limited, both in terms of anterograde and retrograde amnesia. When people get a concussion, they don't forget who they are, typically, right? So that like Jason Bourne um, head injury leading to not remembering who you are or that you were in the CIA or whatever, right? That's not typically the symptom. Typically, you get limited issues forming new memories and limited issues remembering past memories. I'll walk through that on the next slide. Here's a figure from the text kind of breaking down the effect of closed head injuries um, and concussions on amnesia. And what you see is that there's limited retrograde amnesia, right, from a period of time before the blow to the head. And then before that, there's normal cognitive function. So you don't forget your childhood from a concussion. Typically, there's probably something else going on if you're forgetting your childhood. And then we tend to get anterograde amnesia as we're coming out of unconsciousness, right? So this is typically, during the period where somebody's kind of confused about where they are, they're not processing information very well, they're not encoding the information very well, and so somebody might be conscious, having conversations for a period of hours or days, and then have difficulty remembering that period of their life after they come out of the coma. So you may not remember how you got the concussion in the first place, and then you may not remember coming out of the concussion very well over time. Typically, that recovers over time, though. Okay, so you can see this difference between retrograde to the past and anterograde amnesia to the future. And also, you can see that this is limited in the case of concussions. There's some implications for this in terms of how our memories are stored that we'll talk about in the next video.